Mr. Weiss, first of all, the public impeachment inquiry is beginning this week. Since starting November the 13th, we're going to hear a lot of testimony aired live. The first is going to be one by the acting U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, and the deputy assistant to the Secretary of State, George Kent. And there's going to be a lot of other testimonies over the course of the next few weeks. So, what are you personally going to be looking forward to in these testimonies?
Well, I mean, the closed session testimonies, which have now been released, the full transcripts, 2,500 pages of statements issued by several U.S. diplomats and national security officials, that really kind of sets the agenda for the open proceedings. The most banner or blockbuster lines from those testimonies are going to be interrogated now in front of the Klieg lights for the American public to see. So I'd be looking for things like, Bill Taylor, for instance, reiterating his objection to doing this incredibly indecorous and possibly even illegal scheme whereby you're trading in political information in exchange for normal bilateral relations with an American ally, the so-called quid pro quo. Fiona Hill, who was full of insights, as I would expect her to be, as one of the best biographers of Putin. Some of the things that she said, in particular, the fact that Donald Trump will have been surveilled by the KGB starting in the late 70s, given his business ties and also his marriage to a Czechoslovakian national. These things are going to come up again and again. Also, keep in mind now, the Republicans who have every interest in protecting this president, they will have done their Oppo homework, and some of the lines that they want to propound here, including trying to stand up the various conspiracy theories that Giuliani was trafficking in, this guy John Solomon, very dodgy reporter, quote unquote, for The Hill, who's now come under scrutiny. For instance, I would expect the Republicans to try and legitimize the conspiracy theory that it was Ukraine that actually engaged in cyber espionage against the United States in 2016, that the CrowdStrike servers are located somewhere here in Kyiv. And then indeed, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, joining the board of Burisma, was guilty of all kinds of corporate malfeasance or is himself a corrupt individual.
Yeah, so you mentioned this a bit, that the Democrats and the Republicans will have differing strategies regarding the impeachment inquiry. So what will they be sticking to? For example, the Democrats will be doing their best, will be going out of their way to scare Trump to show that he's a bad guy, basically, and the Republicans, what are they going to do? How are they going to counteract this?
Well, so to me, the top line of this whole thing, and you notice the president is framing this as a witch hunt, as a coup, yet another attempt by the feckless Democrats to delegitimize the results of the 2016 election. That's been actually strategically savvy of him because his base shows no signs of fracture. The hardcore sort of MAGA Trumpkins in America are rallying around this president. In fact, that base is arguably even expanding. And any Republican who so much as questions the narrative is basically tossed out on his ear. There was a case of a congressman in Florida who basically said, I just want to hear the evidence, and the constituents ran him out of town on a rail. He's not seeking re-election. However, the real issue here, and unlike the Mueller investigation, leave aside the fact that it's a Democratic-controlled subcommittee, or subcommittees rather, that is pursuing this impeachment inquiry. The top line here is it's actually Republicans who are delivering the bear bodkin to this president. Bill Taylor, Republican statesman in good standing going back decades, a foreign service type served under George W. Bush. Even Sondland, who is basically a partisan hack and a donor who became a diplomat, even he stepped on his own tail by having to retract what he said before Congress because his memory was suddenly refreshed by the testimony of others. He is a Republican. I don't know what party affiliation Fiona Hill has had, but by being willing to serve in this administration, she clearly showed that she was at some point okay with Donald Trump's presidency and wanted to do right in terms of guiding America's national security with respect to Russia. This is not a Democratic conspiracy. it's very, on its face, you can't make that argument because the call is coming from inside the house, as they say in horror films, right? These are former White House officials who are basically making the case that this president was using the status of his office to seek political compromise on his likely rival in 2020 and was withholding crucial military aid to an American partner and ally, as the condition for receiving that compromise.
We're going to return to the issue of this bipartisan divide a bit later, but first you mentioned Sondland, Gordon Sondland, the US ambassador to the European Union who suddenly took up the Ukrainian portfolio and started acting as if he were, in fact, the chargé d'affaires interim to Ukraine from the United States. Well, what struck me most as I read his evidence, as I perused his evidence, was that it really was so easy for a person not actually engaged with the Ukrainian topic to be engaged in the Ukrainian topic by the behest of the President of the United States, because he referred to those words. Is this a new normal in US foreign policy, that just on a whim of the President of the United States, someone can start to take up really crucial issues like the Ukrainian one?
I hope it's not the new normal, but look, we've been talking about two tracks of diplomacy, and I use diplomacy very, very loosely in inverted commas here. What you're really talking about is the official State Department relationship with Ukraine, led by people such as William Taylor, the former ambassador Yovanovitch, and the second track is essentially officials who have been seconded into the Trump 2020 re-election campaign, namely Rudy Giuliani, but also former Energy Secretary Rick Perry, Ambassador Sondland, to some lesser extent, and I can get into why I consider this to be one of the main tragedies of this whole affair, Kurt Volker, who is very widely respected, was very widely respected, but seemed to think that he could sort of walk this knife edge of saving and in fact bolstering US-Ukrainian relations whilst at the same time appeasing a volatile, mercurial, and frankly idiotic president by playing to some of his sort of notorious weaknesses, his sort of art of the deal style, businessman negotiating, sensibility. And I think Volker, unfortunately, does not come away covered in glory, given that he was sort of party to this conspiracy. Bill Taylor, on the other hand, again, pumped the brakes at every opportunity, said this is completely untoward, this is borderline illegal behavior, I want nothing to do with it. So look, you essentially have professional diplomats, patriots, foreign service types who put country before party, going up against, as I say, either loyalists to the president or those who thought they could somehow manage that dichotomy. And the latter, I think, are going to come away deeply scandalized, embarrassed. And somebody like Rudy Giuliani, frankly, I don't know if any crimes have been committed here. He certainly seems to be associated with now alleged criminals, namely Mr. Parnas and Fruman. But no, I mean, you talk about a complete about-face in national stature and reputation. America's mayor, the former federal prosecutor who put away gangsters, is now seen as kind of a water carrier for not just gangsters, but the worst that the Ukrainian political establishment had offered up. And in fact, the kind of corrupt official that Hromadske and the subsequent reforms and elections and plebiscites that have taken place was designed to kind of expunge from this political system. And this is the other irony to me, and actually not an irony, it's sort of the crisis. America for years lectures Ukraine on cleaning up its act, becoming a transparent liberal democracy, getting rid of sort of the crony kleptocratic mechanisms that have been in place since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, what do you see? You see America behaving like a post-Soviet kleptocracy, deeply compromised and with massive conflicts of interest at all levels of government. And not only that, but then elevating, as I say, particularly in the form of two former prosecutors general of this country, who were tossed out because of their poor performance and their dodgy behavior. Elevating those officials and at the same time defaming the exact element that we want in the United States to foster in this country, the kind of civil society actors, investigative journalist, Sergei Leshchenko, tearing them down and saying these guys are essentially spies or foreign operatives or people who are meddling in American democracy. I mean, this is a complete and utter scandal for the United States. And what worries me is this is not the way I want Ukraine to be reported on or talked about in America, right? The good name of this country is being dragged through the mud courtesy of a domestic presidential scandal, which is the worst possible outcome you could have for Kyiv at the moment.
You may remember those words from Marie Yovanovitch's testimony when she said that effectively the State Department has been hollowed out by all these unofficial, irregular policy efforts towards Ukraine. In your opinion, and in the regard to what you've already said, does it mean that the State Department has effectively become subjected to the whims for the White House and its current occupant, Donald Trump, if I may say so?
I don't know that it's become, well, it's certainly, I would put it like this. The State Department, members of the State Department do what they're intended to do as American civil servants. They are not informed, though, by the White House as to what's actually taking place behind the scenes, this kind of cloak and dagger policy making that Donald Trump is using his surrogates and emissaries to do. So the State Department is being undermined. I see this not only with respect to Ukraine, but also with respect to Syria. This precipitous withdrawal that was announced a month ago, the green lighting of a Turkish invasion of northeast Syria. The last people to know about this were senior State Department officials, the Pentagon, including the American servicemen who are stationed in northeast Syria, and all of America's allies, some of whom actually have boots on the ground there as well. And this was the result of a phone call between Donald Trump and the president of Turkey. And we also don't know what else is taking place behind the scenes in terms of possible business arrangements or financial streams flowing from Ankara to Washington, D.C. So this is what you see. You see a kind of a parallel government, for lack of a better term, whereby the chief executive of the country is doing whatever he wants and not informing the people who are meant to implement his written and avowed policies.
Yeah. Well, this public impeachment inquiry has been going on for some time, and we've seen that public support for it has reached like 50%, if I'm not mistaken, but it's been waning a bit and it's been fluctuating a bit, its support. And however, still the percentage of people supporting Trump's current policy, actually supporting Trump, is relatively stable, like 40% with more or less. And does that mean that all those things, they do not affect Trump's core audience? Actually, people supporting Trump at all, does that mean that all these inquiry things and all these public impeachment inquiries is just kind of a show up for the Democrats, or will they have no effect?
I think, Republican talking points on this have shifted from there's no there was no quid pro quo to okay, there's a quid pro quo, but so what? Everybody does it. American presidents have done this in the past. I think where it's going to head now, and it's already beginning to, two different streams here. The first one is, many Republicans still believe that the Democratic National Committee, the Hillary Clinton campaign, went to Russia, dug up dirt on Donald Trump, basically did what they're accusing the Democrats of having done in 2016, what Donald Trump is now basically proven to have done in 2019. So in other words, they're going to draw moral equivalency between the Steele dossier, all of the old conspiracy theories from 2016 about, how Donald Trump was investigated and scrutinized by the opposition, to what's happened now. And basically, in the form of Devin Nunes, who is barking mad as a congressman, and is really pushing some of the most outlandish, sort of counterfactual ideas about what's taking place. This is his line.
You may remember when he said in Sondland's testimony that the European Union is doing effectively the same, conditioning its aid to Ukraine on some anti-corruption efforts. You remember that, yeah?
Yeah. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to see Fox News, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh. Eventually, they're going to resign themselves to, okay, yeah, Donald Trump instructed people, go find out what Biden's kid is up to and if there's any illegality there. And until you do that, you're not getting your military aid. But so what? And they're just going to run a campaign saying Biden's kid is, the privileged son of an overindulgent and corrupt longtime veteran politician. It's going to be part of the re-election campaign strategy, basically. Biden represents the establishment of the swamp. Remember that phrase from 2016? Donald Trump has been trying to drain it. And again, the reality of what Donald Trump has been doing and what his family have been doing, his son is now on a disastrous book tour trying to promote a text in which he says driving past Arlington National Cemetery reminds him of all the sacrifices the Trump family have made. These things, I mean, it's like out of the onion, but it doesn't register with the space, For somebody like myself, it's very difficult to say what I'm about to say because my whole professional life, the one thing I've tried to avoid as a foreign correspondent, somebody who studies international affairs, is drawing moral equivalence between liberal democracies, particularly my own country, and either illiberal non-democracies or, shall we say, authoritarian regimes. It's become almost impossible now not to make the case that America under this president, or at least a sizable portion of the electorate and the kind of media apparatus that informs that electorate, are behaving almost like either a kind of Soviet or post-Soviet, system. Party nost, this idea that the party makes the reality. It's, it is always correct. It cannot be challenged or criticized or scrutinized. That has taken hold in the GOP to the point where, a party that used to have healthy traditions, at odds with each other and try to kind of come to some consensus, but debate and dissent was encouraged, all of that's gone now. Yeah. You're an enemy of the people if you don't line up behind this president. It's a very terrifying thing. And for me, I don't know the answer to the question I'm often asked, and we as Americans ask ourselves, is this a temporary phenomenon? Is this just an anomaly because of this man in the White House? Or is this something that, irreparable damage has been harmed and has been done, rather, and this trend is going to be irreversible? I don't know.
Yeah. What I'm going to say might sound a bit counterintuitive, but sometimes what's happening in the United States regarding all those impeachment inquiries is kind of resembles to me what's happening in the United Kingdom over Brexit. Both countries have become extremely divided over, in the case of the United States, over Brexit or whether to leave the European Union or not, and in the United States, first, whether to support Trump, and now whether to support the public impeachment inquiries or support the impeachment case in general or not. And I think this has come as kind of a tricky question whether the country can become whole again. In the case of the United States, what do you think of this?
I worry about whatever the result of the next presidential election is going to be. If he loses, the best case scenario, given his nature, is he decides to be the kind of permanent ex-president that some of his predecessors have wisely chosen not to be. I mean, particularly the last two, Obama and Bush, they go off and cultivate their garden or, make their gazillions of dollars on the lecture circuit and open their libraries, but they don't really regularly, on a daily basis, intervene in the national conversation, just as a matter of decorum and out of respect to the successor in the White House. This is not what Donald Trump is going to do. He will probably found some kind of media empire, aspire to be the next Roger Ailes or Rupert Murdoch, create a TV channel that will make Fox News look like NPR. He's going to be loud. He's going to be abrasive. He's going to tweet. He's going to defame. He's going to come up with petty schoolyard nicknames for the next president and the next kind of class of political officials who are elected to Congress. he won't shut up. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is, yeah, he kind of foments some civil unrest in the United States. He's already flirted with the idea of mob violence sweeping the nation if he doesn't get back in office, or if he were to be impeached and convicted and thrown out of office before his term is up. The worst case scenario is, yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say civil war. That has a very specific connotation, and I don't see the military cleaving in half and actual fighting each other circa the 19th century. But a national social and political crisis that cripples the country, yes, I could see that happening. And by the way, it's a little too easy to say that Trump is the original pathogen in American politics. He's very much a symptom of not just what's been happening in the U.S., but what's been happening worldwide. You have a situation in which the last news cycle, in which during the last news cycle, the president of France gives an interview to The Economist, says NATO is brain dead, and really kind of comes out as not a continental multilateralist who believes in the transatlantic relationship, but almost an aspiring unilateralist who doesn't want to ask a buyer leave from Washington or Brussels, wants to pursue his own national policy, is kind of trumpeting sort of the banner concepts of, frankly, what a Viktor Orban or a Vladimir Putin would say about national sovereignty. In fact, makes admiring mention of both Orban and Putin kind of in that interview. That is, I think, Macron is giving expression to what a lot of European stakeholders and elites are now thinking. I just read an article today about Mr. Kolomoisky saying it's time to embrace Russia. The man who single-handedly kept Dnipropetrovsk from falling into the hands of the so-called separatists, right? Controversial in many respects, but the one thing you couldn't say about him was that he was a stooge for Moscow. Now, the West is finished. This seems to be a prevailing notion. And it's on the left and it's on the right. And it ties into, obviously, this kind of populist wave that has swept, North America and Europe. In some places it's receding, but in other places I think it's only growing.
Well, a question I forgot to ask you about all those impeachment inquiries is about the personality of John Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump. There was a report in Bloomberg last week, if I recall it correctly, you may have heard about it, saying that it was effectively Bolton who lifted the block on military aid to Ukraine that was supposed to have been provided by the United States, not the President of the United States himself. Yeah. And later, Bolton hinted at having to say more about conversations that have not already been made public. And should he actually turn up before the House of Representatives, would you expect him to deal a severe blow to Trump's presidency and be a great boost to Democrats?
So it's an interesting question because, look, Bolton is a traditional conservative Republican hawk. He's not a neocon. He said that many times himself. He doesn't really believe in democracy promotion. He believes in militarism. He believes in advancing America's national interest. Insofar as he believed in arming Ukraine, it was to deter and contain Russia. He's actually respected in Moscow because he takes such a hard line against the Kremlin, and they quite like that, right? He's not somebody who's easily pushed around. The problem I see with Bolton being the kind of heretic who undoes this presidency is, well, twofold. Number one, the Democrats would basically turn him into a martyr if he did that. But the Democrats were the ones who howled with rage when he was appointed National Security Advisor, and he has nothing but contempt for them. This was the man who was going to lead America into war with Iran. He was mocked, he was savaged as somebody who should never come anywhere near the White House. I don't see him taking one for the team or going to bat, to mix metaphors, with the Democratic Party. Number two, I think he is savvy enough a political player in his own right that he would understand that if he did basically stick the knife into the GOP and the president, he wouldn't be allowed back into the good graces of the party and would never occupy a position of power in any administration going forward. So I think Bolton is looking out for Bolton. He's not necessarily concerned with the stature and enduring democracy of the United States. And also there's other things like he's got a book deal, so maybe he's saving his real ammunition for, you know, the launch of that book. He's looking to cash in. But yeah, look, he actually, believe it or not, he comes across as, you know, another one of these rare professional officials in the White House. I mean, he believed he called it a drug deal, you know, what Giuliani was trying to orchestrate. He's never gotten such good press as he has in the last month. And I think he's also kind of savoring that and maybe wants to prolong that by keeping everyone in the dark about what he'll do. He also doesn't want to testify. He says he's going to sue Congress if they subpoena him, which is an indication, again, that he's looking out for number one.
Kind of waited in the wings for his chance to shine, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to turn back to the topic of Ukraine. You mentioned about the Hromadske article you wrote as far back as today. And it seems to me and to many Ukrainian observers that the topic of Ukraine has become really, really toxic in the United States, in US politics especially. There's been this reporting Foreign Policy saying that the position of US Special Representative for Ukraine is going to be abolished. Well, there's no real indication for that right now, but still there are some rumors going on about that. And there were also some phrases about the Ukraine fatigue in some of the testimonies. And all that points out, sadly, at the fact that there's no one in the United States, in US politics, to deal with Ukraine, to, say, maintain Ukraine policy, to maintain the Ukraine case, the Ukraine portfolio anymore. Well, does that mean that Ukraine has become kind of a forever toxic topic in the United States? Or this situation can somehow be alleviated?
I don't think it's become forever toxic. But you know, the biggest problem facing President Zelensky, and I wrote an article right after the whistleblower complaint came out, saying, look, his popularity here is still quite high. That's good for him and pushing through whatever reforms he wants to do, you know, advancing this ambitious domestic agenda. But the real problem is Ukraine cannot afford to lose the bipartisan consensus in the United States that it must be supported both diplomatically, commercially, and indeed now militarily against Russia. It's in danger of losing that, at least in the short term, because, for instance, when you read in these testimonies that, oh, we were this close from convincing Zelensky to go on Fareed Zakaria on CNN and make a statement saying we're investigating Burisma, Democrats are going to see that as, oh, so he was willing to go along with this drug deal, right?
Yes, there was this New York Times report when he actually agreed, but when the U.S. military aid was suddenly given, and all that just disappeared. Yes.
But so in other words, Washington, or at least a good chunk of Washington, will see him as having been willing to connive in this unconstitutional quid pro quo arrangement with the president. That's bad for Ukraine. Coming back to what I said earlier, again, I think Americans, unfortunately, I mean, just to be quite honest with you, and you know, I shouldn't be saying this because it's what I do for a living, go in other countries and reporting on what's happening abroad. Most Americans don't care about abroad. They don't really care. I mean, they care about Russia because when they turn on cable news, it's sort of the height of the Cold War again, and you know, the Russians are up to no good, and Putin is this kind of grand puppet master of everything nefarious happening in the world. And you know, a lot of that's been sensationalized and turned into a bit of a cartoon. And I say this as somebody who's been warning about Kremlin machinations for over a decade now. But when it came to Ukraine, I think there was a natural American sympathy. This is a country in Europe. It's had its territory stolen from it. It's got Russian troops under the guise of being, you know, patriots and volunteers occupying, you know, its eastern region. But Ukraine wasn't in the headlines, and Americans had kind of gone on with their lives and had to deal with this guy in the White House who makes a tweet, and that becomes the news cycle. Unfortunately now Ukraine is in the headlines because it's being pulled into a domestic political scandal, and also unfortunately, as I said earlier, the worst Ukrainian officials who were essentially seconded into selling disinformation they now have their name in lights. Lutsenko, Shokin, people that you kind of want to have forgotten about are coming back. And this is going to leave a sour taste in Americans' mouths. You also have the president who maybe not, he's not tweeting this, but he's been quoted as saying that he just doesn't like this country. He thinks it's all corrupt and it's a burden that America should sort of cast off. Perhaps he got this from conversations with Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin. Perhaps that's just his natural instinct because, again, he believes Ukraine tried to rob him of the presidency, the way Hillary Clinton believes, with more justification, that Russia tried to rob her of the presidency. So yes, in the short term, I think Ukraine has become a bit radioactive in the American sort of media ecosphere. However, the one thing it's got going for it, and I say this as somebody who I've been here now twice in the last 2 months. Prior to that, I had been here in 2014. So there was a 5-year gap. I have noticed a dramatic transformation in Ukrainian society, just in Kyiv. It's become a global city. It stands a good chance of becoming the next Berlin, if not the next Paris of Eastern Europe. I am not being hyperbolic when I say that. It seems more dynamic. It seems more at peace with itself, encouraged by political transformations that have happened, peaceful political transformations. And bizarrely, we don't like to use the word normalization because that usually means making an accommodation with unpleasant circumstances. But normalization has occurred, and I think as positive a way as it can happen. I was at the Yes conference in September, and this was not a conference that you would expect to see of a nation at war and under occupation. The theme was happiness. It seemed very frou-frou, like something out of 1970s New Age Los Angeles. And I thought it was a bit silly and bizarre, but then I reflected on it and I thought, no, actually this is good. This is a country that wants to get on with its life and not, most importantly, not be defined by its victimhood, by its having been invaded and occupied and having been kind of the punching bag of its next door neighbor. That's important because if Ukraine becomes a truly sovereign country with its own agency and attracts foreign direct investment and attracts tourism and people want to come here, not to sort of sniff around and see what the Russians have got up to, but because they genuinely enjoy being in Ukraine, that will have been the biggest success story of Euromaidan. And that will be something that I think Americans can appreciate in future, if not right now.